Hey everyone, my name is Siyi. I'm an economics specialist, and today we're going to look at a practice macroeconomic exam question. All right, let's get started. So, today we're going to cover the topic of demand. First, we're going to answer the question, what is demand? Then, we're going to cover individual versus market demand. And finally, we're going to cover what can cause shifts in the demand curve. All right, so first, let's answer the question, what is demand? Well, this is simply the quantity of a good that a buyer is willing to buy at each price. So, what does that actually mean? Let's illustrate this with a fun example. Pretend there's a girl named Sally, and she loves going to the movies. However, the amount of movies she's willing to see each year will still depend on what the price of the movie tickets are. I mean, that makes sense, right? If tickets are cheaper, she's going to be willing to go see more movies. Say the price of movie tickets are $6 per movie, then she would be willing to see 8 movies per year. But if tickets are really expensive, say they're $18, then she's only going to choose to see the best movies of the year, the blockbusters. She's not going to be able to afford to see the smaller movies. So she's only going to go see 2 movies per year. So this table that shows the quantity demanded against every price point is called a demand schedule. If we then take Sally's demand schedule and plot it on a graph, then this produces a downward sloping line called the demand curve. This is a very important concept in economics, and you're going to be seeing demand curves everywhere. Notice how this slopes down. This is going to be true for the majority of goods and services in the world. That makes sense, right? As the price of something gets lower, the quantity demanded goes up. This is a fundamental rule called the law of demand. Next, we'll dive into the difference between individual and market demand. Let's say there's another person in town, Brett, and Brett also loves going to the movies, even more than Sally. So you can see that he wants to see even more movies per year at each given price point. At $6, he wants to see 12 movies a year. Then, what we're going to do is take Sally's demand for movies, we're going to add it to Brett's demand for movies. You can see that we get this chart here on the right, which combines both of their demands. So at $6, you're taking 8 plus 12 equals 20. Now, suppose we did that for every single person in town. So we take Brett's demand for movies, plus Sally's demand for movies, plus Kelly's demand for movies, and everyone else in town. What is that going to get you? By summing up everyone in town's demand, you'll probably end up getting something like this, a demand schedule that shows at $6, the entire town demands 400 movies. At $8, the entire town demands 350 movies, so on and so forth. We would then take this demand schedule and plot it onto a chart, just like we did before for Sally. And we might end up getting a curve like this, except now this is going to be called the market demand curve instead of the demand curve for individual people in the town. Lastly, let's talk about how the demand curve could change. It makes sense that over the course of a year, things might change how people perceive watching movies. A demand curve will shift when there's a fundamental change in people's willingness to buy a good or service at any price point. This can happen when the taste or perception of the good changes, expectations change, or the prices or availability of related goods change. Let's take a look at some examples. Let's pretend that over the course of a year, the price of popcorn goes down. What do you think would happen? Well, people in town might be more willing to watch more movies now because if they save money on popcorn, then the overall movie watching experience is cheaper. If someone was only willing to go see 8 movies when the price was $10, they might now be willing to see 9 movies because they can buy cheaper popcorn. If everyone in town is willing to see more movies at each of the price of the tickets, then the market demand curve is going to shift to the right. So for example, at $18, the market demand previously was at 100. But now, because everyone wants to see more movies because of cheaper popcorn, the quantity increases to 200. Each point on the curve shifts to the right. Now let's talk about a situation that might shift the demand curve in the other direction. What if the price of streaming subscriptions go down? Well, then more people might decide to subscribe to these streaming providers. And if that happens, they might choose to stay in and watch TV over the weekend instead of going to the movies. Then, if more people in town are getting streaming services, then at each price point, they might choose to stay in more instead of going out to the theater. So before at $6, total demanded movies was 400 for the entire town, but because more people are choosing to stay in and watch streaming services, then the demand falls to 300. This happens at every single price point, and so the entire curve shifts to the left. But price shifting for related goods is not the only way that the demand curve can shift. Things like taste, expectations, and the number of buyers in the market would also shift the demand curve. All right, now let's get into the practice exam question. Which of the following would cause the demand curve for fast food hamburgers to shift to the right? 1. A bunch of grocery stores in town go out of business. 2. People become more health conscious. 3. The price of fries increase. Or 4. The price of hamburgers decrease. Take a moment and pause the video if you have to, and then we'll continue. All right, let's see the answer. So the answer is 1. A bunch of grocery stores in town go out of business. If that happened, then buying groceries is going to become harder for people, and so they're going to be more willing to eat fast food. So that's going to increase the demand for hamburgers. 2 is not going to increase demand. In fact, people becoming more health conscious is actually going to decrease demand for hamburgers. For number 3, the price of fries increasing, that's going to lower demand for hamburgers as well because fries are a complementary good. And so if the price of fries increase, the overall fast food experience will also increase. What about for number 4? It's a common mistake to think that the price of the good itself decreasing is going to shift the demand curve to the right, but that's actually a common mistake. That's not the case. What that does is actually it's going to just move along the curve versus shifting the curve itself. A movement on the demand curve occurs when there's a change in the price and quantity of the good, but the demand at every price point hasn't changed. So for example, if the price of hamburgers go down, say from here $5 to $4, then the demand might go up from 400 to 600, but you can see that that's just going along the path of the curve itself. That's not actually shifting the curve. So remember, changing the price of the good never shifts the demand curve, only moves along the curve. All right, let's recap what we learned today. First, we learned that demand is the quantity of goods that a buyer is willing to buy at each given price point for the good. Then we learned that individual demand is just the demand curve for one person compared to market demand, which is the demand curve that sums up all of the individual demands. And then lastly, we learned how a demand curve can shift. This happens when the prices of related goods change, consumer tastes and expectations change, or the number of buyers change. All right, that about does it for our video on the topic of demand. Thanks for watching, and I hope you check out other practice problems and examples on Chegg.